Hello and welcome to another TLDR Explains video on the government's uneasy relationship with the civil service. In this one, we're going to be taking a look at Cabinet Secretary Sir Mark Sedwill's resignation, how it fits with a more general trend of senior civil service resignations, and how this government's relationship with the civil service is different to previous administrations. Just a quick shout out to our new book, Brexit, the Colouring Book. Our book takes you through 15 key moments from the Brexit process, letting you colour the images, as well as reading exactly what happened from beginning to end. Not only is this a colouring book and a nice timeline of the process, but everyone who buys it gets access to an exclusive TLDR video. So even if you're not into colouring, you can support the channel, get yourself a timeline of the process and an exclusive video. Also, for a limited time, we're offering serious introductory discounts, and a link to the store can be found below. We've worked so hard on this book, so a huge thanks for your support. So on Sunday, Sir Mark Sedwill, perhaps the UK's most senior civil servant, resigned. Sedwill was both Cabinet Secretary and National Security Advisor, and was appointed by Theresa May. While Sedwill wasn't fired, his letter of resignation to Boris Johnson says that we, Johnson and Sedwill, have agreed that I will stand down. And the resignation came only one day after Michael Gove gave the Ditchley annual lecture, where he criticised the civil service for groupthink and not being brexiteer enough. Sedwill was disliked among Brexiteers for being too cautious and Remainery, and in 2019 warned that a no-deal Brexit would be a disaster. In May, there were anonymous government briefings against Sedwill for failing to get a grip on the government over the coronavirus. This is probably why the FDA, a senior civil servants union, said in response to his resignation, Number 10 has sought to undermine Sir Mark and the leadership of the civil service, with a series of anonymous briefings against him over months. Not only is it a self-defeating and corrosive tactic, it's also a cowardly one. Basically, the point is that while he technically resigned, he was also sort of pushed out. Sedwill's resignation is just one instance of a tense relationship between the government and civil service. Let's give you a quick run-through of just some of the recent resignations. Ollie Robbins resigned as Brexit negotiator in 2019, after constant anonymous briefings against him for not being Brexit-y enough. Sir Philip Rutnam resigned as Permanent Secretary to the Home Office in February, after the government dismissed bullying allegations against Priti Patel, and he's now suing for unfair dismissal after what he called a vicious and orchestrated campaign against him by the government. Sir Simon MacDonald, the Permanent Secretary at the Foreign Office, is leaving in September, following its merger with the Department for International Development, after reports that he was one of 3 civil servants on the government shit list of civil servants that need to be fired. Sir Kim Darroch resigned as the UK's ambassador to the US after leaks by the Brexit Party's former digital campaign chief, in which he described Trump as inept. And Sarah Hurst, who was sacked by the Department of International Trade for warning about the legal difficulties involved in a no-deal Brexit. Something that comes up remarkably often in these disputes between the government and civil service is Brexit. Often civil servants are perceived by the government as not being Brexit-y enough, while civil servants see the government as perhaps a little too Brexit-y, or at least a little too reckless when it comes to Brexit. This shouldn't surprise us too much. It's a common theme in Dominic Cummings' blog posts, and Michael Gove mentioned it in his speech on Sunday. Cummings and Gove make the same criticisms about the civil service. It's too anti-Brexit and it's too bureaucratic, with not enough data-literate people in place. The second criticism is probably fair. No one thinks it'll be a bad thing to have more number-literate and data-focused people in the civil service, although Sedwill did study international economics at the University of St Andrews, and has a Master's in Economics from St Edmund Hall, Oxford, so he's hardly mathematically illiterate. Also, it's a bit weird to then appoint Brexit chief negotiator David Frost as his replacement national security advisor, given that he has no experience in national security, and the role is usually reserved for civil servants with an MI5 or MI6 background. Something that former Prime Minister Theresa May and the person who put him in place complained about in Parliament.
I served on the National Security Council for 9 years, 6 years as Home Secretary and 3 as Prime Minister. During that time, I listened to the expert, independent advice from national security advisers. On Saturday, my right honourable friend said, we must be able to promote those with proven expertise. Why then is the new national security adviser a political appointee with no proven expertise in national security?
Regardless, while that criticism might be valid, the first criticism, that the civil service isn't brexit-y enough, is a more controversial one, because it questions the civil service's political neutrality. Civil servants are expected to be, above all else, politically neutral, which is why they can serve both Labour and Conservative governments. The Civil Service Code says that all civil servants are expected to abide the principles of objectivity, defined as basing your advice and decisions on rigorous analysis of the evidence, and impartiality, defined as acting solely according to the merits of the case and serving equally well governments of different political persuasions. That means that replacing existing civil servants with brexiteers inherently politicises the civil service, which is why Johnson's plan to replace Sedwill with a brexiteer should be, and has been, controversial. It makes the civil service less of an apolitical machine for actualising policies, and more of a political party. Now, to be fair, this government and previous governments have done pretty similar things already. They've replaced civil servants they don't like, or at least moved them to different departments. But this is different for two main reasons. Firstly, the government's objection to the civil service is political. They don't just think that they're slow and bureaucratic, something that lots of other governments have complained about in the past. They think that the civil service is too politically biased in their Brexit reluctance. Once you take up the premise that the civil service is politically biased, the implication is that it needs political rebalancing, and this sets a dangerous precedent. Imagine a future where a Labour government comes in and thinks that the civil service is too brexit-y, or even too conservative. This would result in the civil service requiring constant rearranging, which would lead to a less effective civil service, and certainly a less politically neutral one. The second reason is that this government's criticism of the civil service is very public. In previous governments, if there's been an issue with civil servants, it's usually been dealt with quietly. This government has made a habit of anonymous briefings against the civil service to the media, which it shouldn't really do for two reasons. Firstly, it ruins the relationship between the civil service and government, and secondly, it obstructs political accountability. That's because the government is blaming the civil service to avoid taking responsibility, but the civil service aren't elected, which means that there's no way for the public to hold them accountable. Rather, the government ought to take responsibility, and then the public can hold them accountable at the ballot box. After all, in the famous words of Margaret Thatcher, advisers advise, ministers decide. Ultimately, the government makes the decisions, and publicly blaming the civil service is dangerous because it undermines any sense of democratic accountability. So, all in all, the point we're trying to make here is that you should expect the government to spar with the civil service on occasion. That's the norm. But that this government's anonymous briefings to the media and attempts to change the civil service in the image of Brexit mark a fundamental reinterpretation of what the civil service is, both in terms of political neutrality and democratic accountability. By the way, and as a final point, this is not to say that the civil service, and for that matter the British political class more generally, isn't disproportionately Remain leaving. Most civil servants live in London and are university educated, and if we're going to extrapolate from that, 60% of London and 68% of university graduates voted Remain, so it shouldn't be surprising that the civil service is disproportionately Remain leaving. But this doesn't mean that the government can criticise the civil service. Perhaps it might be a good idea to mitigate this imbalance, maybe by moving more of the civil service outside of London, something which Gove suggested in his speech. But this can be done quietly and professionally, without undermining both the legitimacy and the political neutrality of the civil service. What do you think though? Are changes needed to make the civil service more effective and more representative? And do you think that the government's going about this in the right way? Be sure to let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and as always, you can also get involved over on Discord. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. You can also find more from us across all social networks, simply by searching for TLDR News. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name listed at the end of the videos, just like these people, then you can support us on Patreon by clicking the link in the description.